My name is Brett Courtenay and I'm an orthopaedic surgeon in Sydney. I chaired the two previous meetings we had at Victoria Barracks, but this year, of course, things are very, very different. So tonight we are still having our ADF surgery evening, but we're obviously having it under a very different environment. I would like to thank everyone for their attendance here this evening. We have a lot of specialists, we have a lot of other medical practitioners, and we also have some students who are very keen to look at medical students looking at career in the ADF. I'd like to commence by wishing to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, not only the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation of the Sydney region, but all nations and clans of the lands where this evening's participants live and work. I recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Just a couple little housekeeping matters this evening, and I look on the screen and I find that the majority of people have already got their audios turned off, but I'd ask, because we are recording this evening, if people could keep their audio off. It will stop any background noise and to do that. And if there is a problem, well, you may find our host might do it for you. Tonight, it gives me an enormous pleasure to welcome and to thank our speaker for this evening. It's Commissioner Georgeina Whelan. Georgeina Whelan graduated from the Officer Training into the Australian Army in June 1988. She had extensive experience in command and management. She was the operations officer for 1 HSB that went to East Timor. In 2005, she was moving in to be the commanding officer for 1 HSB. And technically, before she had even marched in, we had the tsunami on the Boxing Day, and she was given the direction to pack up her unit and take it to Aceh, an extraordinary experience. Georgeina continued in a lot of roles in the Army. She continued in leadership courses, and she ultimately became the Director General of Select Strategic Issues Management in the Office of the Chief of Defence at the rank of brigadier. In 2017, in October, for family reasons, Georgeina moved to the Australian Army Reserves and took on a different role involved in the ACT with respect to the State Emergency Service. She was the chief officer initially, but very quickly moved through the ranks, and just on 2 years later, in August 2019, she was appointed as the first female commissioner of the ACT Emergency Services Agency. And that was not that long before the terrible bushfires we had in the end of last year and the beginning of this year. Georgeina does have this knack of moving into a role just as the proverbial hits the fan. Just finally, before I hand over to Georgeina, I just want to give a small personal note. Some years after I went to Aceh with Colonel Whelan at that stage and the team, I was working career advising, doing the health corps, and someone from the psych corps said to me at one stage, after they heard I'd been to Aceh, they said, "How was it?" And I said, "It was pretty tough." I said, "It was hot, it was there, we had a lot of bodies around and everything." He said to me, "Did that knock you around?" And my answer unequivocally was no. And my reason was, we had fantastic leadership. We had leadership that looked after the morale of the people, allowed us to do what we needed to do, and supported us. So we did the best that was possible in those circumstances. And of course, spearheading that was Georgeina. So with that there, it gives me enormous pleasure to invite her to come. She has, I will discuss later some of the accolades. She has a Conspicuous Service Cross with bar, the initial in 2004, and she was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2006. Georgeina, the topic this evening is leadership in times of crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brett, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I might just get my slides up and running. I desperately need my slides because anybody that knows me knows I can talk underwater. So if I don't have the slides to keep me on track, we'll still be here at midnight tonight. So we'll just wait and see if they're popping up. Oh, here we go. Lovely. Thank you. We'll just go to the big screen. Lovely. And we can just flick to the next slide. So I'm Georgeina Whelan. I'm currently the Commissioner of the ACT Emergency Services Agency. And we can move to the next slide, please. That'd be great. And look, and tonight I'm going to talk to you using two scenarios. The first one being the presentation, the deployment that Brett mentioned, which was to the Boxing Day Tsunami in 2004, 2005. And most recently, the role of the ACT Emergency Services Agency and my role as the emergency controller during the Black Summer bushfires, and then leading the agency in support of ACT Health for COVID-19. I'm going to talk about sort of military emergencies and civilian crisis and highlight, in my mind, what is the same, but where there are some differences and why that might be, but also more importantly, I think how military and civilian emergency services can actually learn from each other, which I think is actually very timely given the environment in which we now live in Australia and what may potentially happen into the future. I'll talk about relationships from the tactical through to the strategic level. And then finally, I will touch on reflective practice and why that's very important. Next slide, please. So as Brett said, I joined the Army in 1988 as an officer, and then as a non-clinician, worked in health administration and health operations for many, many years, ultimately being appointed as the commanding officer of the largest ADF hospital, deployable hospital, in just before Christmas 2004. I hadn't actually started my role. I had officially had command handed over to me, so I was responsible for the unit, but I actually hadn't spent a day in the office prior to the Boxing Day Tsunami. And if you can just click the forward button for me, please. What I found, however, was that my military training and what was very clearly defined command and control constructs that the ADF operates under, and the fact that whilst I had only been the CO for several days, this unit trained in a very deliberate way and a very practiced way 11 months out of 12 months of the year. So in terms of its design, its function, and its ability to do its job, all of the pieces of the puzzle were there for me. But the part that, of course, was the most important, over and above the 200 beds, the deployable equipment, and the plethora of other things that we brought with us, was in fact the 154 people that I deployed with, and I was very privileged to command and lead during that operation. And of that 154 people, what was very important to me as a commanding officer, and particularly as a non-clinician, was the senior medical officer group and the senior nursing officer group that we formed, that became my mentors, my guide, and my subject matter experts on all things, not just about running a hospital, but running a hospital, as you can see from the pictures in front of you, in very austere, complex, dynamic, challenging, and to a certain extent, confronting environments. Now, the interesting thing, and I'll come back to this later when we start talking about challenges on our home soil, was when you deploy, and if you deploy into the future, into a third world country, particularly one that certainly doesn't experience first world healthcare, and where the population is suppressed, depressed, and certainly not having experienced the quality of healthcare that we receive in Australia, everything is appreciated. Everything you do makes a difference in a very, very positive way. But of course, one of the challenges when you bring first world capability into a third world country is to be careful that in fact you don't overdo the level of support and the provision of support that you're there to provide. Because certainly one of the greatest challenges is when you pack up and go home, what it is that you leave behind as an organisation and the impact that had on the community. And so I make that point because the subject matter expert group that we brought together, and particularly our senior medical officer and the role of our senior surgeon on this deployment, was to strike that balance between doing the most good for as many people as possible, to ensure that we eliminated gaps in a system. And this is a system that had over 130 non-government organisations all deploy into ARCH shortly after we arrived, or wanting to do very good things. But also make sure that in addressing the gaps, we were also making sure we were not duplicating effort. And finally, that anything that we left behind was a value add and would be enduring for the community. It was quite often when we reflect on the 2020 bushfires with $55 million donated into New South Wales, all now locked into a trust. I think back to the time in ARCH when some international agencies donated some very, very expensive medical equipment, but didn't leave the means or the education for the Archinees to use that equipment after we returned home to our home locations. Next slide, please. So what I find really interesting is I jump forward from 2005 to 2020, some 25 years later, and I have been in this role for approximately a month when we start to see bushfire and natural hazard and Mother Nature start challenging the Australian community, initially starting in northern Queensland and then working its way down the east coast of Australia. Now, by September of 2019, we were already deploying ACT, Australian Capital Territory, firefighters and emergency services workers into Queensland and New South Wales in response to the challenges that both our jurisdictional colleagues were facing. It was also a time when the ACT itself was in a heightened state of alert, a heightened state of readiness. This is a community that was still very scarred and very challenged by the experience that they had in the 2003 ACT bushfires that destroyed over 400 homes in the ACT, with many lives lost as a consequence of those bushfires. Most of the reviews available on the 2003 bushfires highlight the significant challenges that had been faced by the Emergency Services Agency in its ability to communicate with the community, who felt quite isolated and challenged as a consequence of that experience. So I certainly stepped into a role with a community that was on a heightened level of alert and was also quite fragile as a consequence of its previous experience. We then found ourselves leading up to late January, having what was a very challenging season without having a fire itself in the ACT. We were completely inundated with dust and storm behaviour from the south coast of New South Wales, where fire was actually generating its own weather patterns and impacting across our jurisdiction. For the first time, we had what we call bushfire refugees moving their way into the ACT, who were members of the South Coast New South Wales community and the Victorian community, who were displaced as a consequence of the bushfires in their region. And we saw numerous people move through the ACT, including the relocation of over 300 personnel from aged care facilities into the ACT. We then had a series of storms that generated the most significant hailstorm we'd had here in the ACT in 5 decades, damaging over 2,300 homes and almost bringing the car industry in the ACT to a standstill. We then, as a consequence of a beehive and a beekeeper who manages the biosecurity at the ACT airport, who dropped a heat lamp while managing the beehive, trigger what we knew to be the Pielago and then the beard fires in the ACT, which ran through ACT airport, closed down the Australian Capital Territories airport for almost a day and a half, and brought the community to a standstill, and a fire that ran within 463 metres of a densely populated suburb in the ACT. So certainly we were kept very busy until, unfortunately, on the 27th of January, as a consequence of some aerial reconnaissance, it's most likely that an ADF helicopter triggered the ACT Aurora Valley fire, a fire that destroyed 80% of the Namadgi National Park, 82,700 hectares of land, 3,500 hectares of rural land, and flowed into the New South Wales region, running almost 90 kilometres and destroying 9 properties, but fortunately no loss of life. Next slide, please. Now, what was really interesting about the 2019-2020 bushfire season, and not dissimilar to 2004-2005, was that I had a similar group of subject matter experts that I was able to utilise as part of my leadership team, providing technical expertise and direction across the ACT Emergency Services workforce. But what was not as disciplined and what was somewhat challenging was the discipline around that team, which hampered its effectiveness at times in terms of communication, and also the passage of vital intelligence from the fire ground into the planning team to allow us to keep 2 steps ahead of what was a very challenging and certainly life-threatening environment. Can we click to the next slides, please? So I was talking about command and control before we had the meltdown with the PowerPoint. I'm told it's very, very warm in Sydney at the moment. And what I certainly found was that the integration of ADF assets into not only the command and control construct of the Emergency Services Agency's incident management team, but also on the ground. I was almost about to say the battle space there, but across the fire ground, certainly highlighted that whilst we certainly speak the same language, our definition and our interpretation of the terms that we use are sometimes quite different. And where the ADF certainly much promotes an environment of describing the end state of what it is you want to achieve through the application of military assets to a task. That lack of definition and specification to tasks was something that my civilian staff found quite challenging when they were very used to being very definite and very defined in their task allocation to the assets available. Next slide, please. Ultimately, however, though, my experience in 2004 and again in 2020 were the same thing. Identify what the impacts were as a consequence of the hazard. Use the application of resources, whether they be military or emergency services, to the best of my ability to identify gaps, eliminate duplication of effort, highlight strategic assets, define what were critical capabilities that needed to be supported, and certainly do no further harm in the environment and the community in which I was working in. Next slide, please. Because in fact, the context is what's really important. And what I have found, particularly as a leader in environments that are challenging, that are complicated, where there is a lack of clarity, there may not be the definition that we are seeking, where there are individuals who are traumatized from the experience or from their exposure, where there are the demands of the community, demands of politicians, and then the demands of your own staff and particularly your workforce who is out there into the field. If you can provide context for which they can better understand why it is that they're doing what they're doing, how it is we're going to achieve the outcome, and what the end state might look like, then I found that both in the military and the civilian environment, we can achieve a similar outcome. So it is the same, but I suppose what I have learned is the language that we use and our style of leadership, and I'll come to that later, is slightly different and very much nuanced. What I've also found is that over the years, or over 35 years in the Australian Defence Force, challenges that I found along the way with regards to interoperability and integration with Army, Air Force and Navy capability that we subsequently brought together in a very effective way, and particularly ADF Health has led in that arena for many years now. I had not dissimilar challenges within my own agency. The ACT Emergency Services Agency is the only agency in the country that is made up of urban fire, rural fire, state emergency service, the ambulance service, and then from a command and control perspective during bushfires, parks and conservation are also part of our command and control construct. So having 5 tribes who are all seeking to achieve the same thing, but all have a slightly different view on how those things should be achieved, and a slightly different view on who should be leading, and in a hierarchical sense, who should be directing, I found very challenging indeed. But after a couple of days, came to terms with realising it had not been dissimilar to what I had experienced in the ADF some 2 decades earlier. Next slide, please. What I did find, however, was that the integration of all 5 of the services within the agency and the ADF was much, much easier to manage and far more streamlined and effective when we were very clear on roles, tasks and responsibilities, and also the relationship between the outcomes of those roles, tasks and responsibilities as a contribution to a whole outcome for the ACT. And so suddenly it became less about the competitiveness of who was doing what and which role was more challenging or more important than the other. And actually the sum of the parts and that kind of scenario started to really come to the fore, particularly during the most challenging periods of the Orwell Valley fire, when the fire came within 5 kilometres of the Australian Capital Territory's rural-urban interface. Next slide, please. So the 2 systems now that I've become familiar with is the Australasian Inter-Service Incident Management System, which is the system used by emergency services, and of course how we conduct military operations and the command and control doctrine that we're seeing that we see in the ADF. And what I have found is that as the ADF is realising it needs to become far more agile and more flexible for its future force, and how command and control may play out in the battle space, is that need for agility and flexibility and decentralized approach to control versus command is actually something that firefighters do really well on a rural fire ground. And it's something that ambulance services do really well in support of major operations. And I actually think that in terms of leading in crisis, there are certainly some lessons from how civilian emergency services do operate in a crisis when there is a defined task and a defined outcome. and that the ADF, I believe, can learn from that somewhat into the future. Next slide, please. So I talk about leadership through crisis rather than in crisis. And I must admit, the same consistent themes come through very regularly. And I was listening to Andy Roberts' presentation at AMA earlier in the week, as he had been, leading a key health response in Western Australia during COVID-19. And I've got to say, the themes, the principles are not dissimilar. First and foremost, honesty and integrity are very important. Now, what I found during the bushfires was that the honesty and integrity that came to the fore was actually with our community. There is a very fine line between alerting and not alarming a community to the challenges that it may face. And certainly the health and well-being of a community in a time of an environmental crisis or a natural hazard is as much reliant on the relationship and its ability to interpret and understand the messaging that is sent from emergency services leadership during a time of crisis. And so that when it does hear a call to action, which is very important in terms of the actions community members will take to reduce the risk of life and morbidity for themselves and their families, having a relationship where, as a leader, you are seen to be honest and to be messaging with integrity is just as critical as the emergency services responders that you put on the ground. For leading through a crisis, particularly one that goes for a lot longer than a 3 or 4 day crisis, and that's certainly something we've experienced here in Australia this year, both with the campaign approach to bushfires nationally and then rolling into a very extended COVID-19 environment, was having a vision and being able to share that vision so that your team can chart their pathway forward, and so that you can balance the operational tempo, but you can also have the commitment of your team, particularly when it comes to requiring longevity of application of effort through a crisis. I've always found that by sharing the bigger picture with your team, you can actually inspire them to innovate and also to bring their own teams on the journey with you. Quite often, I say to a number of leaders, you're not wasting your time if you spend time on explaining the why. Explaining the why is not providing an excuse for what you do, it's providing the reason for why we do what we do. And in doing so, you can actually inspire people to bring the best out of them. I always found that encouraging my team to be able to have the ability and also the confidence to challenge the status quo, to ask the difficult questions, and to be able to highlight areas of concern, to be critical. Certainly for me, as throughout my career, as the non-clinician, as the non-firefighter, as the executive and leader of organisations, but not necessarily having the technical qualifications of my workforce, I've always relied on my team to have the confidence to challenge, to ask the questions, and also the courage to think outside the box. And of course, what goes hand in hand with all of the points I've made is the communication skills that will allow us to effectively communicate, and certainly leading through crisis, adapting and being agile in the communication style that you utilise. There were quite often days throughout the last summer where I felt like quite the chameleon, because the communication style that I would utilise with firefighters on the fire ground was very different to what I'd use with the media team. Certainly very different from the person 400,000 people every day saw on Facebook talking about the bushfires, and very different again in working with government and the senior public servants through the crisis. Next slide, please. Ultimately, I believe that leadership saves lives. And I don't just say that from a health perspective, I say that in everything that we do, because not only is good leadership vital through an operation, it's also vital for your personnel pre, during and post a major event. I think as leaders these days, understanding our accountabilities and responsibilities and having the moral courage to hold our own staff accountable and responsible for their roles and responsibilities is as equally as important as our relationships and teamwork. And for me, something that I really had to become very aware of in the last 12 months was having self-awareness and personal insight. If it's the one area that I have been the most challenged in the last 3 years, it has been making that transition from brigadier to chief officer and commissioner, and realising that my presence, my manner and the way I interact with people has needed to be adjusted somewhat. Not that it's inappropriate, but it is certainly challenging and for some people confronting, because I am a brutally raw and open individual, and certainly learning to curtail my enthusiasm, my desire to share the bigger picture has been really, really important. And most importantly has been performance management, and performance management for two reasons. There are staff that I have brought with me on a journey through major events, particularly challenging environments, and I've had to let them go at the end of it, or I've had to stand them down during the event. Equally, I've identified very talented individuals that I have rapidly moved through the ranks and put into a key leadership role, despite maybe not having the years of experience that some of their colleagues have. But I do think performance management, in terms of both talent management and performing and managing underperformance, having the confidence and the moral courage to undertake that performance management is very, very important. Next slide, please. Strategic relationships. Now, I used to pay lip service to this, and certainly what I have realised is how powerful you can be in terms of leading with influence in subtle ways and not necessarily the deliberately overt ways. If it's one thing that I have realised is that if you can establish a connection with your community, a connection with your workforce, a connection with the leadership that you work to, you can very, very effectively lead with influence in a very subtle but very, very powerful way. And certainly what I found was that by doing my homework and reading my audience, and then applying a style of communication that was lending itself to establishing that connection, I found that to be very, very effective indeed. And that's something that some leaders do naturally and others need to think about and to practice. And that doesn't mean that we lose our authenticity. It means that we're thinking about what it is that we're seeking to achieve. We're identifying the key relationships and we are applying a communication style that will lend itself to optimizing those relationships to achieve the operational outcome or the outcome that we're seeking in the environment in which we're working. Next slide, please. So I got a little bit excited over summer, so excited that I forgot to go to sleep and found myself in the midst of probably about week 6 of an 8-week campaign where I had not been looking after myself anywhere near as well as I should have. And I had 2 events in the operations room where, you know, if I look back and if I could just take those 90 seconds back, I would. And I replay it in my mind. I try not to ruminate on it. I try and reflect on it. But on both of those occasions, I was particularly harsh in my commentary. I was honest, but I was particularly harsh in my commentary to a couple of individuals. And I did not realise the impact that had on those individuals, nor the impact it was having on the half a dozen people who heard those conversations. But like any good Army officer, at the end of the operational period, I conducted a very detailed after action review process where I encouraged everyone to actively participate and share their observations, their reflections, their thoughts, and their recommendations on how we could continue to improve our organisation and identify those things that we do well that we wanted to sustain. And certainly I brought in external objective independent consultants to do that in a very relaxed, unintrusive environment so that people could share their thoughts openly, which 500 people did, of which 4 people were very clear in their view on me. What I wasn't expecting, however, was that after action review would then be leaked to the media, which is what it was. And I look back now, and if I had my time again, what would I do? I would actually do everything, all those books and all those presentations that I've gone to, where people who've gotten far more experience than I will ever gain in my life tell me, you know, tell us, make sure you rest, make sure you take time out, make sure you pace yourself, you know, make sure your resilience bucket is not too empty, make sure you refuel the tank. Because if I actually did self-care 101, I wouldn't have gotten myself into the situation where I became exhausted. I was overly harsh with 2 individuals. And then that led then to the sharing of my loss of composure to the community. Now, I can take a hit like most people can, but what I didn't realise until that particular point was the impact my behaviour was going to have on the reputation of my organisation, on the confidence the community would have in the agency I lead and in me as a leader, particularly into the future. So I've had to certainly do some reflection in the last 12 months and remind myself of the leadership practices that I promote to others, to ensure that I remind myself to practice those myself. Having said that, running the after active review process as a reflective practice rather than one where we ruminate and then we don't learn has been a very, very positive and constructive one. And certainly some very, very good things have come out of that. But you do have to be thick-skinned and you have to be willing to act on the feedback that you receive. There's no sense running after action review processes for the sake of it and a tick in the box exercise. You certainly will lose credibility with your organisation and you'll lose credibility with your community. Next slide, please. So overall, 2 major events, 20 odd years apart, same side of the world, 9,000 kilometres apart, one with lots of water and lots of rain, the other one with lots of bushfire and lots of hail and lots of smoke. Certainly lots of challenges along the way. But the one consistent theme that I have found through both events was that when you know your people, when you trust your people, when you surround yourself with good people that you know and you trust and you allow them to do their job to the best of their ability, then that's in fact what enables you to be able to lead effectively through a crisis. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very, very much, Georgeina. I think I can speak for everyone, say that was an outstanding and honest and wonderful presentation. You always have been a great leader. I actually had one of your officers who had been ex-Vietnam who did state that he felt that you were the best leader he had ever had. And you had it, it was that honesty, it was all those things that you did. Commissioner Whelan is more than happy to take questions, and we're going to ask you to go through the chat line to do that. I just want to, I suppose one of the things we talk about with leadership and things like that is how much is intrinsic in an individual, how much can you learn? You will be well aware that I was, in my military career, was probably a little recalcitrant when it came to doing the courses that one was involved. But the one course I did do, which I think set the pattern, and you alluded to it during your talk this evening, was the LOBC, the Military Logistics course, where they spoke very much about the desire or the mission for 1 up and 2 up and 1 down and 2 down. And I found that to be a very, very valuable thing. And I'm sure most of the military people will know that where you sit in the thing, you think about what your immediate commander and what his or her commander will do and what you do to the people below you. Look, do you want to just comment on how that positions people as individuals towards a leadership and how it helps them if they take note of it?
Thank you. That's a great question, Brett. Look, I'm a firm believer in being brilliant at the basics. If you can get the basics right, then the building blocks can be value added moving forward. And what I've certainly found with both my experience in defence and what we are learning in the Emergency Services Agency is the value of that initial training or education, and whether that's in the classroom or reading, articles, books, just talking to individuals, or more formal training that the military offers. I think what it does is it puts everybody on the same balanced playing field, and then you all have a common understanding of the command and control construct and what, the role of leaders at various levels within an organisation are responsible for and need to be, and who they need to be responsive to. What I found in the emergency services is that the urban fire and rescue capability has a not dissimilar command and control construct to the military. Very clearly defined, very, very deliberate scope of command and control and span of control, and a very hierarchical structure where everybody sort of fits into the jigsaw puzzle, so to speak. Why that is just so important is when you lose communication and you're separated. So whether it's teams in the battle space becoming separated, whether it's fire teams on the fire ground becoming separated, because they have the basic understanding of, in case of emergency, break glass. Well, in case of emergency, this is the command and control structure. This is the leadership responsibilities. This is what you are accountable and responsible for. People can then default back to that. They can default back to that baseline. And so in times of crisis, in times when you don't have a lot of time to think, you need to act. In times where you are your staff, most importantly, are in a very confusing and confronting environment, when they just need to know that their number one job is to do what you as a leader tell them to do, that discipline and that understanding of leadership, of how you can lead and adapt your leadership style in the various environments, I think is absolutely critical. And, we have some charismatic, natural-born leaders out there who do very, very well in a very calm and controlled environment. But the application of using techniques to enhance your leadership to achieve an outcome, I think is something that is well worth investing in.
Commissioner, we've just had a question through. How much does discipline play a role in the difference between military and civilian response? And I guess you've partly answered that. It's really in the leadership.
I think it is. Look, and I think the one thing that I did find very challenging over summer was probably a lack of discipline in some quarters of what I perceive to be a lack of discipline in some quarters of my organisation. So if you can imagine an organisation that's made up of about 2,000 paid staff, about 3,000 volunteer staff members as well, and then integrating 500 ADF members into that workforce, all moving around a fire perimeter of 197 kilometres, all with very different roles to play. The success of failure, which for me is about not losing a life. So the success of failure of achieving a good outcome, which is no lives lost, and then the prevention of loss of property and livelihood, is totally reliant on everybody doing their piece. And so when you have a level of responsiveness that is somewhat relaxed, or is overly eager to innovate at the wrong time during a major event, that's the part that I found the most challenging. And I think the part that, to be honest with you, some quarters of my paid staff found the most challenging with some elements of our volunteer organisation. Ultimately, what it comes down to is an understanding that everybody's got good ideas, but there's a time and a place for them, and the command and control constructs, the leadership on the fire ground, and the level of discipline that is applied by staff to doing the right thing all comes into play to get the outcome that you're after.
Yep. And I think in everything you've said, there's such important lessons for us as surgeons and anywhere on our journey to being surgeons. Things like the debriefing that, until recent years, I don't think surgeons did so well. And being inclusive of all your staff and being supportive of all your staff, there's some lessons that we really need to learn and, take in and put into practice in our everyday lives in the operating theatre. We've got another question here. In a crisis for a civilian craft group such as surgery, what advice do you have for a prolonged crisis such as COVID to stay resilient?
Yeah, look, I think that's the $64,000 question we've all been asking ourselves as professionals this year, because my advice is, and I think I used the term before, we have to take a campaign approach. So we're on the long haul. I was listening to Brett Sutton yesterday in Victoria talking, and he was saying the same thing. We've all started working 7 days a week, 20 hours a day, trying to manage this new environment that we're operating in. And then we pat ourselves on the back when we go to 6.5 days a week for 18 hours rather than 20 hours. If eventually we're all going to wear ourselves out. And so I think the thing is about having a campaign approach to it, so pacing ourselves. But the other thing that he highlighted, which was not dissimilar challenge that I had, which was under a lot of our legislation, it doesn't allow those of us in key appointments to delegate. Right. But surgeons can. Yes. There's no legislation that doesn't allow us as leaders to be able to delegate and to empower our staff to be able to step up and take on a little bit more themselves, and to, I hate to say it and sound trite, but to share the load. If we all try to maintain this, unforgettable pace that we've started out with, it's a marathon, and I think that's really what we have to do. And I think that's where the talent management is so important, is taking the time to really know our team well and know who we can lean on, who we can leverage off, and allowing those people to step up. And your comment, Mish, about inclusivity is just so important. If we create environments where our staff feel confident and safe to be able to contribute, I think that's where all the real gems are going to come to the fore, that will allow us to identify that talent, and in doing so share the load, and in doing so help us bank some resilience. I talk about banking resilience, taking every opportunity to do that, because at the moment I think most of us are on overdraft mode, and at some point it's going to run out.
Yes. And I think as surgeons that we've got to do this over summer. Usually we have a quiet time, but we really do all need to have a quiet time and not keep trying to make up our waiting list through January. And we've got to back off for the sake of our staff as well.
I think it's a really interesting thing. I made a comment earlier when we went to Arche, to see the level of gratitude come out of a community that lost everything, that had nothing to start with, and then what little they did have, they lost. And the level of gratitude that we experienced from that community, what I noticed very quickly here in Australia was that that level of gratitude ran out pretty early on in the bushfire season, and then it has run out subsequently during COVID. I think as a nation, we live, such a quality of life here in Australia is just so good, and our standard of living is just so high. I think as a nation, we are too demanding. And it's very bold to say that, but I think we are very, very demanding. And as a consequence of that, it feeds into that vicious cycle then for the rest of the community to continue to serve, and rather than slow down and catch our breaths and wait just a little bit longer. I don't have a simple solution for that, but if it's the one comparison in a negative sense that I could make, it is that, I even found here in the ACT, we didn't lose a life during the bushfires, and we lost no property. We did lose some fencing. But when I compare some of the reaction we had from some of the community as a consequence of that, I was actually quite taken aback as to how disappointed a small percentage of our community was that we didn't do more. And I suspect surgeons are feeling exactly the same way with their waiting lists.
Yes. And I think you're right, but there are so many lessons that we can translate, to the operating room, to our practice, when we're, instilling lessons into our junior staff.
Yeah.
So many lessons from your talk. Thank you very much for giving this talk.
No problems.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Brett, you're muted.
I am. Sorry, there was one quick question to follow on what Georgeina was just saying. And I think it's very relevant, sorry, and we appreciate the time. But the question is, what role do you think media plays in helping or contributing to this culture?
I have a love-hate relationship with the media here in the ACT. It is a very challenging one. They have a very significant role to play. In one respect, in my role as an emergency controller, totally reliant on the media to help share information to the community, to share warnings and alarm mechanisms, evacuations, calls for action. And so totally reliant on the media to assist with that. At the same time, the media turning on a dime and actually creating a level of anxiety and chaos out of nothing.
Yes.
It is something that I know, even in my last couple of years in defence, as the Chief of Staff to the CDF, where I managed select strategic issues, which is essentially his crisis management cell. That's all I did all day for 2.5 years. And I've got to say that I'm not sure it's going to get better. I think it's going to get worse. And I think as professionals, we need to be very wary of that and very mindful of that. I wrote a letter recently, a very constructive one, and within 3 days it was being FOI'd by the media to try and make something out of nothing. So they're convinced that the ADF helicopter, which Defence has already said is most likely to have caused the Aurora Valley fire, they're somehow trying to turn that into an argument that Defence didn't let us know soon enough. And if they had have let us know soon enough, we wouldn't have lost the Namadgi National Park, and that somehow, because I'm a retired Army officer, I'm not holding Defence to account. I think we could make a really good movie out of this one. I could picture the people in it, but it's very disappointing to see the way the media really is playing, in one hand, playing such an important and crucial role in the safety of our community and the well-being, and on the other hand, absolutely directly contributing to what I think is an issue around resilience. and a sense of well-being for our community as well.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. They're just looking for the quick, hot story.
Yeah.
Look, just before I hand over to Michelle to give the final thank you, I just want to just quote one comment from tonight, which really just sums it up. And someone said, wow, that was a very honest presentation. Thank you. Really important message. So I think that that's it, and we greatly appreciate your time this evening. It's been a great experience to have known you and to have worked with you on many occasions, and hopefully there'll be more in the future. And I'd like to now hand over to Michelle Atkinson, who does wear a blue uniform, but we won't hold that against her. And,
I wear blue now, Michelle.
But she's the deputy chair of the New South Wales State Committee of the College. Thanks, Michelle.
And thank you so much. It's a really good presentation, and it's really good to bring everyone together. We're seeing so much of the ADF in the news this year. It's been incredible. And there has certainly been a lot of questions and comments to me from people who know that I'm actually in the Navy, that, you know, that know that I serve, just asking for more information. And for sure, anyone who is after more information, I'm sure that you're available for anyone in Canberra in your free moments. And Brett's certainly free, and there are other members in the College of Surgeons who are happy to have a chat to anybody who has an interest. So thank you everyone for joining in tonight, for not going out on your first COVID-free evening.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye now.